thank you for inviting me here. Actually, Thomas is participating and giving one of the key contributions to the Cambridge history of technology. And that I say also to emphasize how important it is for the history of science and technology to think about and think with archaeology about knowledge flows, about ideas, about the way in which skills, expertise is actually historically produced, and certainly also how we think today about knowledge and its ownership, so proprietary rights of knowledge in general, and what role we scholars and scientists play in that. What I bring to you today is actually part of an upcoming book that I will be publishing soon with a couple of colleagues, so with a group of people. We studied the ownership of knowledge beyond intellectual property, and that actually deals with exactly this problem of how we as scholars contribute sometimes inevitably, but sometimes quite implicitly to the way in which knowledge can be owned and known. And I want to give you a very practical insight into that and how historians of science and technology and people who work on East Asia are actually confronted with that. Today, the title of my talk is still Leavings and Legacies. I will try to speak as freely as possible and to give you as many objects as possible to give you a little bit of a sense what that actually means. I know it's a bit complex. I hope I will not need more than 45 minutes so that we have ample time for questions and answers. So it must have been around the year 2007 when I was sitting in a Chinese restaurant waiting for a colleague who wanted to pick me up to go to an archaeological site. I'm an historian of technology who's most interested in textiles. Textiles just because at one point in my career I got very engaged into silk production, and a lot of that knowledge in China is not necessarily circulated by way of books, but it's coming out of materials. So the research of archaeologists, but also textile restorators, museum people plays a large role. And as you probably know, a lot of construction is going on in China all the time. So basically every day lots of textiles are being excavated and many of them thrown away. In this case, I was very, very interested because they wanted to bring me to a site, a cave actually, with lots of Yuan dynasty textiles. While I was sitting in this Chinese restaurant, somebody nearby dropped a newspaper. And in that newspaper, see, that's first technology, historians of technology are not good with technology. In that newspaper, this photo caught my attention, and I started reading in the China Daily about an Italian site that was just like discovered of a Roman tannery. I read through that article and I thought, oh, how interesting. Tannery, Italy, you might know more than actually me that this is an important issue, like leather is an important product of the Roman Empire. Thank you so much. Of the Roman Empire, and so as such, this is not necessarily an interesting news. But when you sit in China and you wait for going for a Yuan dynasty excavation, you ask yourself, like, why the heck are the Chinese interested in an Italian tannery? And why, of all the news that it could have been bringing out in the newspaper in 2008, are they interested in this tannery? So after I had done the excavation, I went home and I got kind of hooked up, also because tannery is kind of my pet project. It's one of the least documented arts and crafts that you actually find in China. And I started to search, like 2008, Italian tannery, do the Chinese have a cooperation with it? But what I came across was actually this. So in the year 2008, there was a huge crisis in the leather industry of China. So China has been an important export place for the leather industry since the end of the 19th century and produced leather mostly for Europe. But in that period, Chinese started to go against pollution. In particular, the tannery sites, as you can imagine, modern tannery chemistry produces a lot of pollution, and they wanted to get rid of these companies, in particular in the urban side. So there was a huge campaign in the Chinese newspapers about how you actually could produce leather more sustainably. So that seemed to be an interesting part of it, but it could not really explain why they actually get interested in archaeological sites. Tannery in China is not a thing, or like leather is not a thing in China because they consider it to be a Bavarian product. China is the land of silk, it's not the land of leather, it's not Italy, right? So that industrialization is one part of it, but it's not something that you would culturally situate into China. To the contrary, leather in China really is something that the minorities are producing, a word you usually don't use anymore today, but still, it's not a Chinese product. So I continued to search and I went into the academic literature. And I realized, and this is only one part of it, that actually tannery is really very badly researched in China. And if so, it's mostly researched as a question of the very, very modern science. So the proto-chemical phase, right? The kind of chemistry that people knew before they actually knew chemistry. And the contents that you can actually find in Chinese literature about that, and this is the quote I'm basically giving you here. Is this? Yeah, here. Yeah. So it's basically two reference points that you can find in texts that say anything related to tannery. The rest of this academic literature is basically research done by material scientists or archaeologists trying to identify from their analysis what kind of skills or knowledge about leather and tannery the Chinese had. So now when in the fast forward you move into the year 2008, what made the Chinese interested in Italian tannery was in fact a very complex campaign of including leather as an intangible cultural heritage into their cultural portfolio. So this is basically the tail end of that initiative. So in the year 2006, China appealed for the first time to the UNESCO to include a couple of minority and their own Han Chinese craft of leather production, and appealed to the UNESCO to make this intangible cultural Chinese heritage. From the year 2006 onwards, up until the year 2018, roughly, you see a rising campaign of people, archaeologists, material scientists, museum restaurators, textile people, historians of science and technology, all getting a lot of money to research leather production in China. So this was actually the broader context of why the Chinese, for instance, were interested in Italy, why they were looking at archaeological sites in Italy, and why they were thinking about making themselves a part, or making leather a part of their Chinese cultural identity. So what you see here is a shoemaker who claims to be a successor of a long tradition of crafts of dealing with leather. So if you look at this period, then suddenly leather turns into a Chinese cultural item. And suddenly you see lots of research also showing that there is a lot of leather in lots of fields, military, for instance, house building, in certainly in clothing, shoemaking, you name it. Wherever you can find it, once of a sudden leather turned up, and leather turns to be an important issue. This question of materials in context and epistemologies of expertise is what actually interests me. And I want to show you, based on 3 steps, how the research about that is very much concerned with the way in which both us as scholars, and I mean here in particular me as a historian of technology, are getting involved in it, but also how the way in which historical knowledge is collected is increasingly an issue in understanding how the sciences and the technologies developed and how this turns out to be national histories in one way and global or not so global histories in another way. So I will move through a fragment of the Arthur Liebe collection. I will introduce that first to you, then I will explain to you the concept of inscribing the artifact, about which I've written elsewhere. You will see that. And then I want to move on to give you a more spatial perspective of where you can actually see the materials of silk and leather. It's a project that I'm also very invested in at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, with lots of people contributing. And then I want to conclude with a very short outlook into leather books in Europe. So here, this is the list of a rather well-preserved burial site that is now in a Russian collection, formerly the Arthur Liebe collection that was bought by a Russian colleague, and is now exhibited in one museum, in a special museum in Moscow, to which I was invited to give my expertise, I think, in the year 2017. This collection is quite a nice catch for a textile historian, because it's very complete. It has a list accompanied with it, so a list of the items that were in the burial site, and it has all these items preserved together. The problem is we don't know where it comes from. We only know it somehow ended in the Liebe collection and then somehow ended up in Moscow. We assume that this collection was, or that the burial site itself must have been somewhere in Sichuan, but the only background we have to that is because the cellar came from Sichuan. That's basically all you can find out. So the provenance of these pieces begin with the year 1954, when Arthur Liebe bought that collection. These are some of the pieces that were listed there. The interesting thing is that it consists of some very extremely well-preserved robes of the 13th, or at least at least dated to the 13th and 14th century. It has, as you can see here, a lot of accessories, and it has purses with contents. And for textile historians, this is a very, very interesting collection. Here you see all of it, because you don't only see the costumes, and it's really in a very good condition, but you also see how people lived with these items. So in that purse, for instance, you find the fragments of the textile. So they were probably supposed to be for repairs. So it seems to be really not so much only a burial boot, or as the Chinese say, qi, but it is probably also something that that person lived with. So something that she used, at least partly, on a daily basis. We can probably later go on to the items if you want to know more about the costumes. But what is quite important for my research is what made people really hook up on this collection was that the silk textile is done with gold weaving. So it is like the so-called gold gilded weft, yeah, Goldfadenweberei. This gilded weft technique is quite an innovation of the 13th to 14th century. So it's not that you can't find gilded thread in, for instance, in cotton in Egypt much earlier, much earlier. But by the 13th and 14th century, you start to use that, or like weavers start to use that on quite elaborate loops. So they mechanized it. They did it very expansively, and they used a new technique for it, in which you have an above ground and an underground weft, so that the thread can really be put together. And the real innovation of that is that you can use this, the gold thread is so thin that you can actually weave it together with silk. So silk has basically 8 times smaller than a cotton, than the best cotton thread of that period. And you can imagine it's not very easy to put these two very different filaments together. So here you see a remnant of that gold thread. So for the most part, the gold was no longer there, but here in this part, it was still preserved. That was here, you see it, just that you have a sense of that. It's actually here at the rims of the rope. We call this kind of weaving tatarichi, or it has also an Iranian name, it has a Chinese name, jivji, or nashi, or nashe. So all across the Asian, the East Asian, the Asian, and the European worlds of the 13th and 14th century, you find this textile mentioned because it was a global silk good. It was one of the really most precious things. Everybody wanted to have it. If you go here to the churches in the Ruhrgebiet, you will very often find like remnants of this kind of textiles, often originating in the Near East, but occasionally also originating in East Asia. And especially when it's done with silk, it probably came as looting goods from the, what's it called, Kreuzritter? Yeah, from the Crusades here to Europe, and was formerly probably a Chinese good. I mean, there's a lot of research about it. I think I don't want to go into that, but we can talk about that. So there's a very good book by Juliane van Vilks about that, who went through all the churches and collections in Europe and found loads of these pani tatarichi. And I think she has a very good overview also about the different techniques that you were actually using. I just wanted to show you what the most precious ones of them may have looked like. Some of them really very well preserved. So for a textile historian, it's certainly interesting to look at the product itself and to look at the filament and the weaving to understand how these products were made, yeah, and to see that they were actually made with a machine and not by hand. Yeah, so to see whether you have, for instance, a mistake that is repetitive, but also to see how you actually make two so very different materials. So the very, very fine silk thread, the filament, that requires at least 8 to 16 cocoons to produce at least weavable thread, right? It's not about the tensility, it's really about the thickness. And around the, like crude and hard material, like the gold thread work together. So what we basically have is what we don't have, right? So what is missing? I don't need to explain that to you as archaeologists. That's what textile restoration actually looks at. And what they're certainly interested in is the techniques of producing these gold threads. So what is the core of the gold thread? Are you using pleated gold? Are you gilding it? Are you gluing it on it, etc., etc.? So I sat with this colleague in Moscow in Russia, and we looked at all these textiles and tried to understand what had actually happened. So this is one of the microscopic analysis of this textile. And we tried to reconstruct it. So just to know what the textile actually is, how it was actually made. And now you can see also what I meant by the double weft, right? So that you actually produce it in a way that you can actually keep the gold thread while you are having layers, like 8 layers of weft by silk, make up one silk thin thread, which gives you a sense of like what kind of materials they could have used. There are 2 persons who've actually really researched the making and the production of gold threads in textile production. One of it is David Piacobi. I think he passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. And the other one is Anne Worwell, also a textile historian. Both of them speculated or were quite convinced that the gold threads of the Yuan dynasty, so of the 13th century in Asia, all originated from the Mediterranean area, so that they all came from this region, and that they were actually then traded to the east and then were used for these rather expensive silk textiles. And they based most of their analysis on material sciences. So the idea that you can actually really look at the gold and then you know where it comes from, and the idea of an African whatsoever gold thread trade and the Near East being crucial to it, and the Near East having the most the most proficient silversmiths who would be able to produce this. So I got very curious about where do these things come from. We did do a lot of material analysis, but we did also think very thoroughly about this way in which the silk and the leather and the gold, the silk and the gold is actually preserved. And we realized very quickly that when you really look at the textiles, what matters is not the gold, but it is the core of the silk thread. So whether you use silk, linen, or leather, or what you can also use is paper. Because depending on what you use at the core, the thread is either very small, or it's flat, or it's thin. So it's changing its form. And that you can see in the remnant of the textile when you actually analyze it. And we realized that at least the robe we were looking at always at its core had leather. Yeah, it didn't have linen, it didn't have silk, it didn't have rami, it had leather. Yeah. So that got me hooked up again on the leather question, right? So where does the leather come from? What do we know about it? We know basically a lot, at least I know a lot about silk, how it is preserved, who knows it, who owns it. But in the context of China, we assume that there is no leather. Yeah? And that's also a good reason for Jacobi and Well to argue that the gold threads you find in these regions do not actually come from China. China is land of silk, right? It's not a land of leather, so it must come from the Near East. Yeah? So it seemed all to fit, right? It seemed really very nicely to fit, but I was not really happy with that explanation. So we continued to think about this question of expertise and skills and what we actually know about. So I give you, I hope I'm still okay with time.
Of course.
Okay, yeah. I give you a very brief run through the idea of how the Asian sphere, or how actually spheres are defined by their materials. So in the case of textiles, this idea is very much informed by the 16th to 17th century. So this is when Indian cotton was brought to Europe by the British Empire. And basically all global books that you will write, that you will see, will tell you something about the change of economy by the influx of cheap cotton into Europe and its replacement of, for instance, the linen industry, the rami industry, every other plant fiber. So this is a map that was drawn by a manufacturer, James Yates, also a guy who first divided the world in different textile filaments, yeah, as a trader, and who tried to identify where certain filaments are used, yeah, and he also writes about where, for instance, in Egypt, cotton is used, but then also that gold threads or silver threads with leather are made in Africa, right? So that this is coming somehow from the south of the Mediterranean, wherever it's coming from, maybe from Cyprus or Sicily. I mean, it was not really clear about that, but clearly it was not an Asian thing. So this is kind of the connection between Jacobi, Orwell, and James Yates. 200 centuries of configuring the world in different kinds of materials. So I spoke a long time now about the 13th century, just as a reminder for all of you who probably are more at home in the very early history rather than in the 13th to 14th century. This is the period of Kublai Khan. So you may have heard the Pax Mongolica, or you may have heard that there were different polities, all Ilkhanats, so all of some Mongolian tribes, whoever they were. Yeah, some people from the north who allied together and then governed and ruled over Asia into Europe, into Africa. So there was a lot of connection going on that did not, or that was not there beforehand. So I'm interested in the 13th to 14th century because the Yuan dynasty, like really, I think they were the first who really thought of silk production as a global trade, yeah, as something that they wanted to expand everywhere. So it's a kind of state capitalism. Before, I mainly studied the Ming dynasty, which is the successor of the Yuan dynasty, and that is important to know because actually it also shows how we historians are influenced by our research. The Ming dynasty really hates the Yuan dynasty. And it basically, like, it's one of the prosperous periods of China when everything was unified and everything was rich, and they produced a lot of silk and then traded with it. And they basically said everything the Yuan did beforehand was bad. Yeah? And I believed it. I must actually say my dissertation was about silk production, and I was reading through it, and I'm like, yeah, that's how it actually is. But reading through the stuff of the Yuan dynasty 25 years later, I realized that I was really spooked. Yeah, and that actually the Yuan dynasty was the one that actually really expanded silk production on a large scale. I think it's very easy to understand if you think about a northern tribe that was like basically paid by tributary mostly silk, tea and horses from the south, so as to not conquer China, right? So it's a peace treaty. You give them something and you get something from it. Somehow between the, let's say the 11th to the 13th century, the people of Kublai Khan and his successors were no longer happy with that trade. So they conquered China. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, is then the one who is actually taking rule in East Asia as a Chinese ruler. And he is really invested into silk. And he's really trying to make it a global trade, global in the sense of like in his territory, he wants to produce silk everywhere. He wants to have his riches. And actually his successors are actually following up. And we know that by now because in the last 15 years, lots of excavations have been made, especially in this area. And in this area, in the Black City, they found a lot of documents about how this silk production, or how officials and Mongols tried to push the silk production into many, many different regions. So here into the south, it's quite a long story. But the gist of it is actually that it totally changed our view about how that expansion actually went. So one of the ideas is that in Yuan China, the Mongols were not really interested in silk, but they were very interested in the expansion of cotton, and that cotton replaced. What these documents now showed is that they were equally interested in silk and that they wanted just the cotton to free the resources like that formerly, like the silk that was formerly used for other things so that they could use it for high-end products. I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but I want to get to this point of like why that led to a real change in the textile trade in general. So in the 13th century, what then happened is that the Yuan dynasty made huge investments into technology. They expanded the industry of looms. They produced more looms. They produced more silk, and they produced more of this luxury wares, and then they gave them, like the Seljuk one, to all kinds of people. So they basically made luxury products an everyday product. You can imagine this in the following way, just to give you a sense of like how the excavations of textiles in the last years have changed it. I know it's a bit rough. So before the Yuan dynasty, so before Kublai Khan started this campaign, we know that in the north you mainly use plant fibers, felt, and leather. So this is this region. Then, let me see if this works. Then we know that by the Yuan dynasty, so when Kublai Khan was not yet ruling, that silk was mostly produced in the area of Sichuan and here in the north of China. Shandong, Hebei are the places. In the south, they mostly use flax, bast, and plant. Yeah, so like that's basically what you find in the textile. And then we know by now that cotton already was in China by the 13th century, and it mostly came to the Gansu port, and a little bit here also from the south. But this is basically what you find as the textile fibers in the texts and also in the textiles. Okay, so in between like 40 to 50 years, we see the situation entirely changing. We see that in the north, there is still the felt and the leather and the plant fibers. In the south, the same. But silk has now expanded to a much larger region. So you see it moved here from the north into the south, and it moves to places like the Gansu corridor, and it moves more into Sichuan. Yeah? So this is basically what you find in the texts, in local archives, and what you find in the tombs, so in the burial goods, as a representation of the use of textiles. And you find cotton at the same place where you find silk. So silk or cotton did not replace silk, but cotton and silk were grown together. Okay, I need to shift gears and show you something else because I want to go back to that artifact and show you what it says. So I mentioned to you that this find was very, very exceptional, not only because it showed that a very, let's say, probably very normal family, either by trade or by theft, could achieve very precious clothes and could probably also have worn them, but also because when we opened the robe, we found inscriptions on their inside here at the sewage. And we found 3 of them. And because restoration was necessary for all of these pieces, and actually the colleagues also wanted to really understand this piece, they all took it apart and put it together again, right? Not actually by doing it themselves, but digitally. Yeah, so they reproduced it and then digitally took it apart. And they make lots of material analysis. I cannot even repeat that because I'm not an expert in that. But here you basically see this is what the robe looks like. Here is where the seams were opened. And then we started to analyze it. So here you have like 3 names, yeah? You have one name here, you have a second name here, you have a third name here, and you have which you can't really see very nicely, you have a stamp here. I show you first what is written there. So there is this is a family name, and it may be a given up, and it's possibly a number, right? So we think that it's probably the storage master, right? Or somebody like who was preserving that piece. The next one is actually really quite interesting because it looks like somebody wrote Chinese who doesn't really know how to write it. But then also they put a frame around it, which makes it look like a stamp. Yeah. And this is relating to what I call inscribing the artifact. So in the Yuan dynasty, in order to make sure that the officials knew that they had to pay, that the taxes were paid, that the corvée labor was actually delivered, they did not have registers or name lists, but they asked the craftsmen to inscribe their names on the products that they were delivering, no matter what product it was. So whether you produce a chair or a table or whatever, a gold piece, you have to inscribe your name. And that only, or not only, that for tax purposes and for the reason of quality. So tax counting happens on the object. It doesn't happen on some kind of archival records or written down. And it happens for quality reasons. So if this product is not good, you can go to the craftsman and he has to replace it, or she has to replace it. And actually, I think most of the textile producers are actually she's, you know. So this is the reproduction of how we think this robe was woven. So this is important. I hope I'm not too long, but it's important for the reason that the real technical innovation of that period is not only the mass production, but that really that a lot of these mass productions were technically very sophisticated because you weave cut to appropriate to the cut. Yeah, so that the bolt has like basically everything in, and let's say the pattern is already in the right place for the cutting. Yeah, which means you need a drawing with the pattern tower. I don't know if you see that they're a little bit like a jacket loom, just that you need two people, and you have to really have a pattern book that you pull. And then you can actually really weave quite quickly because you only pull the shuttle through it. But you can produce these bespoke bolts very quickly. So we found out that this is how actually the robe is produced, and that it is produced in the most efficient way. And that it is produced in a way that, if you can see that here, I think I have another picture. You see it here, you see some red marks. So I think I have a bigger picture of that. Sorry. So if you see that, then you can see here like the red numbers, yeah. And this is where the inscriptions were. So the inscriptions were made of these names, not when the robe was finished, but they were made when the bolt was finished, you know, which gives you a sense of like the sense of the quality organization of like how you actually go through the text. So what we inferred from then these names is that you have an official who is actually like basically signing the piece off. The craftsman who is delivering the task and is in charge of the quality, then the storage or tailor who is actually producing that piece, and you have an ownership mark, which you see here. Yeah, that's in Paxpa. So that's the Yuan dynasty script, because this one was actually put on the piece after the piece was put together. So after it was sewn together, after it was made into a robe. Yeah. So now it gets really very interesting also, because when we really put that robe together, you could see that this bespoke piece was not cut for a woman. So it was not woven for a woman, it was woven for a man and then cut to fit for a woman. Yeah. So a really, really interesting piece. And it means that this piece or this bolt was actually out of imperial production. So it was not made by some weaver somewhere, but it must have gone through the official system. So some of the many weaving bureaus that the Yuan dynasty installed in their territory. So in the Chinese context, we have a textual source that is really very interesting to also to understand where resources are and how they are located locally. These are called the local gazetteers, the defunctional. And I have a big project that looks at these defunctures. They start somewhat actually at the 5th to 6th century as a way of local archiving. And then by the 8th to 9th century, the Chinese emperor starts to really formalize this genre. And they have like local gazetteers written and published and republished every 20 to 30 years. And they have that until 1912. Yeah? And certainly in some places you have like a rather good lineage of these local gazetteers, so about 1,200 years, like every 30 years a local gazetteer reproduced, and in others you only have 1 or 2 of these local gazetteers preserved. But it's a really decent and very big source of information. These local gazetteers like basically record local resources, taxes and tribute, local people, art, like architecture, right? Everything that is important to a locality. That certainly changes throughout the ages. But they, from the Yuan dynasty onward, what they are really interested in as local resources is labor or expertise. So what kind of craftsmen are working there? And what can the Yuan dynasty recruit in order to make things? Like the silk ropes. So we looked into these local gazetteers. The Chinese digitized them, but we developed a tool to research them and like to also understand them, how they are actually working and what kind of information changes well. And the red dots basically give you a rough estimate like of in which places there are many, many local gazetteers and for which places we have local gazetteers. So this is some of the lists that you find in the Yuan dynasty for the places where silk is produced. And this is a very rough translation because you have like endless lists, yeah. But they give you a sense of the kind of people you would be able to recruit locally, and you would be able to recruit to make such a textile, right? And among them is like casters, carpenters, excavators, but certainly also cotton fluffers, for instance. And then certainly you have the loom makers, you have the weavers, thread twisters, and so you have long lists. And in some of these lists, you find also people who produce leather or who produce gold, but very, very few of them. So here's a legend. Those places, I know it's a bit crude, where you would find people in the combination of things that would allow you to produce these ropes. Yeah? People who produce silk, people who produce leather, and people who produce gold. Yeah? The interesting thing about these, like for me as a sinologist, about these lists was that some of these lists have people who can, right, so who produce leather. Yeah, and that you find people, I was super surprised, who wash gold. I didn't even know that the Chinese are washing gold in the Yuan dynasty. And this is what this list represents. This is actually only a chart to show you how we do the analysis. And I want to switch to, like you see, they have the weavers, the dyers, the tailors, the gold makers. And you have, I mean, what is also very interesting, you have usually like a maximum of 72 crafts. So none of these lists, you see they are actually really manipulated, has more than 74 craftsmen on them. So you don't have like 100 or something like that. You have less than 72, but you never, like only 2 cases have more than 70. Some manipulation is going on there, right, over the Rahmen period. So finally, I ended up at the tomb that I wanted to look at, yeah, when I was sitting in this Beijing place and reading the newspaper. So here's an image of that. And this excavation of the Yuan tomb shows something that the Chinese consider of themselves like not really Chinese, rather Mongolian, because as you see, there is a lot of gold, yeah. And there is also leather in it. I know you don't see it here because the gold is more obvious and the the images that you are allowed to make in an archaeological excavation as a non-archaeologist are not very good. But it was one of those cases where you actually see there is a combination of things that you don't expect and that you immediately, at least as a, like what the first intuition is to say, this is not Chinese. Yeah, this is Yuan dynasty. This must be something that is not happening there. So here is, now that you get a sense of it, so here is what we know from the texts and from archaeological excavations, ruins and the like, as confirmed places where such weaving of robes actually happens. So most of them are in the north. Some of them are actually producing gold threads, so that is in the texts, yeah. And then the local gazetteers give you, this is all imperial sources, the red ones, and the local gazetteers additionally give you these places as important places where imperial robes were produced. But these are places that the official sources do not, like the imperial sources, do not necessarily acknowledge, but they are in the local gazetteers. So I give you a rough map of China here. So this is basically China proper here, and this one is more in the north, so it's more here. Yeah. The find that I was talking about in Gapso, the Black City, where you find all these documents about the expansion of the silk and cotton trade and how you actually do it, is here. Yeah. Just that you get a sense of the territory. And here are the places where you find, or where there, we know there are gold repositories in China. And interestingly enough, and I think I have another, I'm not entirely sure. So interestingly enough, in these places, you find, I know this is a little bit difficult, but in these places, it's not necessarily in these places where you find gold washers, but it is in these places where you find some. But in particular, you find them at those places where you have these local gazetteers weaving and dyeing looms. Yeah, which does not necessarily mean that they found gold, but what it means is that the Yuan dynasty was trying to make the people find gold at those places where they wanted to produce these textiles. And this was trying to find at these places also people who could tan and produce leather. See, that's here, basically. That's one of the places where we can confirm that you have a local gazetteer weaving bureau, so a bureau that produced imperial slaves, that enrolled gold washers, and that has, from an excavation site, a tannery, an official tannery, so of some size. Yeah. So this brings me almost to the end, yeah, to the question of the threads that hold history actually together. If I, from the beginning, would have believed my textual sources, I would have followed, for I'm pretty sure about that, the documentation of people such as David Jacobi or Anne Warwell, and I would have been quite sure to have argued in one of my essays that most likely the gold threads with the leather core probably originated from somewhere from the Near East. After having followed the traces that I had from a more or less, I would say, serendipitous find, and the request by a colleague from Russia to come and see her collection, I would have never guessed that the Chinese were actually in the 13th century heavily involved into gold washing, and that tannery was a major trade. So what you usually would assign to China would be, as you see on the right-hand side, the jade piece rather than the gold. This gold is from the 13th century tomb that I showed you a second ago after it was cleaned. And it certainly belongs to a belt, yeah, and this most likely was a leather belt. So these things are preserved, and they are preserved in a particular way. I wanted to connect to that because I think in the year 2018, I came across a colleague in Birmingham, Christopher, now I forgot his second name, sorry, it'll come to me anyway. And he got interested in the research about leather, like leather books, and where that leather actually comes from. And he came across a particular collection of the 15th century in a British mansion. And there he found out as well, or he's at least quite sure, that all the leather that was used to bind these books, British books, French books, Greek books, well, they came from Asia. And he's quite sure about that, probably also because the scholar he is interested in and who possessed these books was particularly interested in China as well. When he restored the books, he furthermore found a small piece of a tanner of the 15th century who was writing down his recipe. So this is another confirmation in Chinese, yeah, another confirmation that the leather trade was at that time probably quite well spread and well known in China as well. So now I end with a very short message for the question of ownership of knowledge, and maybe for the historian of science and technology like me and the archaeologist like you. When I was going to meet Christopher and talk with him about leather and these leather books, which was more or less a coincidence by that point in time, we were drinking a coffee in a shopping center. And that shopping center in Wood is the former Woolston Tannery in Birmingham in the UK. Yeah, and this tannery is now a really nice shopping center with a great coffee shop. I really recommend you to go there. And everywhere it has signs about this place, how important it was to the British industrialization, and how important it was in particular for the British trade with India and China, and with like making excellent leather for the British Army. The interesting thing about that is like we could only sit in this shopping center and enjoy it because certainly all these plaques ensured us as the customers that all the poisonous, like right, the leftovers of this industrialization, the chemistry is really very toxic, right? Like it had all been taken away. So you could sit there in the shopping center and it was entirely clean. And Christopher and me were joking about the fact that if in 1,000 years people would go there and all the archives had disappeared, no archaeologist would be able to say that tannery at one point in time had taken place here because nothing was left over by it. It is these kind of experience that I find really very revealing for me as a historian of science, because they tell us something about like how differently we think about the knowledge that is contained in materials, or how it relates to the sciences and knowledge making we actually have today. Some things are written down in books, but the things that are actually preserved in materials, they very often disappear. Thank you so much for your attention.